The Junkers Ju-87 Stuka. Its wailing siren struck terror across Europe during the Blitzkrieg. But by 1943, this iconic dive bomber faced obsolescence. Too slow, too vulnerable against modern fighters. Yet on the Eastern Front, the Stuka found redemption. Armed with twin 37mm cannons and flown by pilots like Hans-Ulrich Rudel, it transformed into something deadlier, a flying tank destroyer that Soviet armor learned to fear. The inverted gull wings and fixed landing gear of the Ju-87 Stuka made it instantly recognizable. Its screaming siren became the acoustic signature of Blitzkrieg, heralding destruction from Poland to France. During the early war years, Stukas operated with devastating precision, their dive brakes allowing near-vertical attacks that placed bombs with surgical accuracy. They were the Luftwaffe's spearhead, the airborne hammer that shattered enemy positions ahead of panzer columns. But air superiority is a fickle mistress. By 1941, the Stuka's vulnerabilities became glaring. On the Western Front, improved Allied fighters turned the tables. The aircraft's maximum speed of just 410 kilometers per hour made it easy prey for Spitfires and Hurricanes. Its lack of maneuverability meant that without fighter escort, Stuka squadrons suffered catastrophic losses. The Battle of Britain had already demonstrated this brutal reality. Entire formations were decimated in minutes. The Eastern Front offered different conditions. Vast distances, fewer enemy fighters, and fluid battle lines allowed the Stuka to continue operations where it would have been suicidal elsewhere. But even here, change was coming. The Red Army fielded thousands of tanks, T-34s, KV-1s, and self-propelled guns rolling westward in steel avalanches. Germany's ground forces struggled to stem this tide, and traditional dive bombing, while effective against fixed targets, wasn't precision enough for destroying mobile armor. The Luftwaffe needed a solution. Several aircraft were considered for dedicated anti-tank roles, including the heavily armored Henschel HS-129. But the Stuka had advantages: rugged construction, excellent visibility, stability at low speeds, and most importantly, thousands of experienced pilots who already knew how to fly it. The aging warhorse wasn't ready for retirement, it needed transformation. And that transformation would come in the form of the heaviest airborne cannons ever mounted on an operational German aircraft. The question was whether the Stuka's aging airframe could handle the punishment, but mounting massive anti-aircraft guns on wings designed for dive bombing, that required both engineering ingenuity and combat desperation, and the Germans had plenty of both. If you're fascinated by aviation history and want more stories of legendary warbirds, hit that subscribe button and join our community of aviation enthusiasts. By winter 1942, the strategic situation demanded innovation. Soviet tank production had reached staggering numbers. Factories beyond the Urals churned out T-34s faster than the Wehrmacht could destroy them. Aerial interdiction became critical, and the Luftwaffe's existing anti-tank weapons weren't cutting it. The 20mm cannons on modified Ju-87D variants could damage tanks, but rarely achieved kills. Germany needed more firepower, and they needed it airborne. The solution emerged from an unlikely source: anti-aircraft artillery. The 3.7cm Flak 18, designed to shoot down aircraft, possessed the velocity and penetration to defeat tank armor. Engineers proposed mounting these cannons under the Stuka's wings in specially designed pods. Each BK 3.7 cannon weighed nearly 600 pounds, not including ammunition, an enormous burden for an aircraft already considered underpowered. Skeptics doubted the Stuka's Junkers Jumo 211 engine could handle the additional weight while maintaining operational capability. The first test flight took place on January 31, 1943, with Hauptmann Hans Karl Stepp at the controls. The configuration proved viable. though barely. The massive underwing pods created additional drag, reducing the aircraft's already modest speed and maneuverability. But the guns worked. They could be aimed, fired, and reloaded without catastrophic structural failure. By April 1943, the first production Ju-87 G1 variants reached frontline squadrons. The conversion process adapted existing Ju-87D-1 airframes. Engineers removed the dive brakes, those iconic slats that allowed vertical dives, because the G variant wouldn't be dive bombing anymore. Its mission was low-altitude ground attack, skimming above the battlefield to deliver precision cannon fire. Each BK 3.7 cannon received a 6-round magazine loaded with tungsten-cored armor-piercing ammunition. The projectiles traveled at 1,170 meters per second, capable of penetrating 90 millimeters of steel at 300 meters. The follow-up G2 variant introduced extended wings borrowed from the Ju-87D5 model, improving stability and payload capacity. These wings provided better handling characteristics during low-altitude maneuvering, critical when executing attack runs mere meters above enemy positions. A total of 208 G2 aircraft were produced, with additional conversions from existing D3 airframes, bringing the total operational fleet to around 230 aircraft. The Germans christened this hybrid warrior the Kanonenvogel, the Cannonbird. It represented the Stuka's final evolution, a testament to German engineering's ability to wring new life from obsolete designs. But hardware alone doesn't win battles. The Kanonenvogel needed pilots skilled enough to exploit its unique capabilities, brave enough to fly through murderous anti-aircraft fire, and desperate enough to attack at altitudes where small arms could bring them down. Hans-Ulrich Rudel would become the embodiment of that lethal combination. But giving pilots the deadliest anti-tank weapon in the sky meant nothing if they couldn't hit their targets, and Soviet armor wasn't exactly sitting still. Flying a gun platform is fundamentally different from dropping bombs. Dive bombing allowed pilots to release ordnance and immediately pull away, minimizing exposure to ground fire. The Kanonenvogel demanded something far more dangerous: sustained tracking of moving targets while flying at suicidally low altitudes. Rudel and his fellow pilots had to reinvent ground attack doctrine. The physics were unforgiving. The 37mm BK 3.7 cannon could penetrate tank armor, but only under precise conditions. A T-34, the Red Army's workhorse, had 20mm of armor on its hull roof, and just 16mm protecting the turret top. The hull sides offered 40mm of protection, sloped at 41 degrees, enough to deflect poorly angled shots. Engine compartments were vulnerable, as were rear-mounted external fuel drums, but hitting these weak points required approaching at the correct angle, within optimal range, while accounting for the target's movement. Rudel developed a tactical profile through brutal trial and error. The attack run began at 1,200 meters altitude, giving pilots time to identify targets and plan their approach. Spotting Soviet tanks wasn't difficult. Columns of T-34s raised dust clouds visible for kilometers, and their exhaust smoke often betrayed individual vehicles. The pilot would select a target, typically the lead tank or the most isolated vehicle, then commit to the dive. Here's where it became lethal. To achieve reliable hits, pilots had to descend to just 50 feet, 15 meters above the ground. At that altitude, the Stuka flew through small arms range. Soviet tankers and infantry carried PPSH submachine guns, Mosin Nagant rifles, and DSHK heavy machine guns, all capable of damaging the lightly armored Stuka. Tank commanders standing in open turrets would fire everything they had. The air became a storm of lead. But the Stuka's slow speed, a liability against fighters, became an asset here. Cruising at 190 kilometers per hour, pilots had time to align their cannons, track the moving target, and compensate for deflection. The aircraft's excellent downward visibility, another dive bomber legacy, allowed precise aiming. Pilots opened fire at 365 meters maximum, typically closer. The 37mm rounds, traveling faster than the speed of sound, reached their targets in under a second. A successful hit was unmistakable. Tungsten-cored projectiles punched through thin top armor, penetrating into crew compartments or engine bays. Secondary explosions followed, ammunition cooking off, fuel igniting, or simply catastrophic damage rendering the tank immobile. A single well-placed round could kill a T-34. 6 rounds per cannon meant 12 chances to destroy armor before requiring a return to base for reloading. The psychological impact was devastating. Soviet tank crews, already fighting a brutal war, now faced death from above. They couldn't effectively return fire against a fast-moving aircraft. Riding exposed on tank decks, common practice for infantry hitching rides, became suicidal. The wailing siren, still fitted to many Stukas, announced incoming attacks. Tankers learned to fear that sound more than artillery. Yet the Soviets weren't defenseless, and their response would force the Germans to adapt or die. Want to see more incredible warbird stories? Subscribe to Vintage Planes and never miss an episode of aviation history. July 1943. The greatest tank battle in history was about to begin at Kursk. Operation Citadel, Germany's last major offensive on the Eastern Front, would pit nearly 1 million men and 2,700 tanks against prepared Soviet defenses. The Red Army had fortified the Kursk salient with layered minefields, anti-tank ditches, and thousands of guns. Tank reserves waited in depth, ready to crush any breakthrough. The stage was set for the Kanonenvogel's combat debut. On July 5th, the offensive began. Hans-Ulrich Rudel flew the only officially designated Ju-87G1 in the battle. However, field modifications meant several Ju-87D variants already carried underwing 37mm cannons. Improvised tank busters created by desperate mechanics who understood what was coming. These hybrid aircraft joined Rudel's newly formed anti-tank squadron, assigned to support the 2nd SS Panzer Corps advancing along the southern axis of the salient. The tactical plan leveraged the Kanonenvogel's strengths. As German panzers pushed forward, they inevitably encountered Soviet tank reserves rushing to plug the breach. These counter-attacking columns, often moving in formation along predictable routes, became priority targets. Rudel's squadron would strike ahead of the armored spearhead, hitting Soviet tanks before they could engage German ground forces. The results exceeded expectations. In the opening days, Rudel's pilots claimed dozens of tanks destroyed. Rudel himself allegedly knocked out 12 T-34s in a single day, a claim that, while possibly inflated by wartime propaganda, reflected genuine battlefield effectiveness. The tactics developed during earlier training paid dividends. Pilots learned to identify the exhaust signatures of specific tank types, allowing target prioritization. KV-1 heavy tanks, with their thicker armor, received less attention than the more numerous and vulnerable T-34s. Combat reports detailed the destruction. A 37mm tungsten round striking a T-34's engine deck would penetrate the thin armor, shredding the V12 diesel engine and often igniting fuel. The resulting fire would force the crew to bail out or die from smoke inhalation and burns. Hits to external fuel drums created spectacular fireballs. Turret penetrations killed gunners and loaders instantly, the round ricocheting inside the cramped fighting compartment. Immobilized tanks, even if not destroyed, became obstacles blocking Soviet advances. But Kursk wasn't a German victory. Despite tactical successes, including the Kanonenvogel's impressive debut, the offensive stalled. Soviet reserves proved inexhaustible. After 2 weeks of brutal fighting, Hitler called off the attack. The Red Army had held, then counterattacked. Operation Kutuzov, launched in the northern sector, threatened to unhinge the entire German front. The strategic initiative had permanently shifted to the Soviets. For the Kanonenvogel, Kursk was both triumph and warning. The aircraft proved its concept. Properly employed, it could kill tanks with precision and efficiency. But it couldn't change the war's trajectory. Soviet armor kept coming, and the Luftwaffe lacked the resources to deploy enough Kanonenvogels to make a strategic difference. The tank busters could delay Soviet offensives, blunt attacks, and destroy hundreds of vehicles. They couldn't stop the Red Army's westward march. And as Soviet commanders realized the threat these cannon-armed Stukas posed, they began deploying countermeasures that would turn the skies into a death trap. The Red Army learned fast. After Kursk, Soviet commanders recognized that German aircraft carrying underwing cannons posed a severe threat to armored formations. Tank columns that once moved with minimal air defense now traveled with substantial anti-aircraft support. Mobile AA guns, 37mm automatic cannons and quad 12.7mm DSHK machine gun mounts, deployed alongside tank units, specifically positioned to engage low-flying attackers. The tactical environment shifted dramatically. Where Rudel's pilots once attacked with relative impunity, now they faced concentrated defensive fire. The German response was to adapt escort tactics. When a Kanonenvogel strike was planned, 2 or more conventional Ju-87D variants, equipped with bombs and machine guns, would accompany the gun-armed aircraft. These escorts circled above the strike group, targeting Soviet flak positions and suppressing ground fire during attack runs. The escorts served dual purposes. They attacked anti-aircraft emplacements, forcing Soviet gunners to seek cover instead of tracking the incoming Kanonenvogels. They also provided early warning against Soviet fighters, which by late 1943 were appearing in greater numbers. The Yak-9, La-5, and later La-7 fighters outperformed the Stuka in every measurable way. A Kanonenvogel, slow and heavily laden with cannon pods, stood no chance in aerial combat. The escorts bought precious seconds, time to complete the attack and escape. But protection came at a cost. The escort missions required aircraft and pilots drawn from already depleted squadrons. As the war turned against Germany, resources grew scarce. Fuel shortages limited sortie rates. Replacement aircraft arrived slowly, if at all. Experienced pilots died or were rotated out, replaced by undertrained novices who often didn't survive their first missions. The Kanonenvogel units maintained operations through improvisation and desperation. Rudel's aircraft frequently returned to base riddled with damage, bullet holes stitched across wings and fuselage, hydraulic systems leaking, engines sputtering. Ground crews performed miracles, cannibalizing wrecked aircraft for parts, working through brutal winter conditions to keep machines airborne. Forward airstrips, often nothing more than cleared fields, became home. Pilots flew multiple sorties daily, landing just long enough to refuel, rearm, and launch again. The escalation continued through 1943 and into 1944. Following Kursk, the Red Army launched a series of offensives that pushed German forces steadily westward. Rudel's unit became a fire brigade, constantly redeployed to crisis points where Soviet breakthroughs threatened collapse. At Krivoy Rog in November 1943, his squadron blunted an assault by hundreds of T-34s. During the Korsun-Cherkasy pocket in early 1944, they provided critical air support to encircled German forces. Rudel himself became a propaganda symbol, the ace pilot flying impossible missions against overwhelming odds. Nazi media celebrated his tank kill count, which grew steadily. 100 tanks, then 200, then 300. Behind the propaganda lay reality, a skilled pilot leading exhausted men in obsolete aircraft against an enemy that grew stronger daily. Rudel's personal courage was undeniable. He attempted a rescue mission when one of his pilots crash-landed behind enemy lines, landing his own Stuka in enemy territory. The rescue failed. Rudel was captured, then escaped, swimming across a river and walking 50 kilometers back to German lines. By August 1944, Rudel claimed 320 tank kills, but individual heroism couldn't change strategic realities. The Red Army reached Poland, Army Group Center collapsed, German forces retreated toward the Reich's borders, and the Kanonenvogels flew alongside them, still deadly, still feared, but unable to halt the inevitable. As Germany's situation grew desperate, the Kanonenvogel's story entered its final, most intense chapter, where extraordinary courage confronted mathematical certainty. The numbers tell part of the story. Hans-Ulrich Rudel flew over 2,400 combat sorties, claimed 463 tank kills, and became the most decorated German pilot of the war. In January 1945, Hitler personally awarded him the Knight's Cross with golden oak leaves, swords, and diamonds, a decoration created specifically for Rudel, making him the only recipient. But statistics, even extraordinary ones, don't capture the Kanonenvogel's true legacy. The final months saw Rudel's squadron operating under impossible conditions. Transferred to Hungary in late 1944, they supported SS Panzer divisions attempting to break the Soviet siege of Budapest. The skies belonged to Soviet fighters now. Rudel was shot down twice in quick succession, returning to fly with his leg in a plaster cast. As Soviet forces pushed into Silesia, the Kanonenvogels operated from airfields inside Germany itself, attacking bridgeheads across the Oder River and covering the retreat of Wehrmacht units. Hitler attempted to ground Rudel, wanting to preserve his propaganda value. Rudel refused. He continued flying until the war's final days, leading remnants of his squadron on one last mission before surrendering to American forces in May 1945. The Kanonenvogel's operational career ended with Germany's collapse, but its influence endured. During the Cold War, NATO faced a scenario eerily similar to what Germany confronted on the Eastern Front, the prospect of massive Soviet armored formations advancing through Central Europe. The USSR's tank armies, numbering thousands of vehicles, represented an existential threat. NATO needed weapons systems capable of destroying armor in quantity, and planners studied historical precedents. The Kanonenvogel's combat record caught their attention. The A-10 Thunderbolt II, introduced in the 1970s, embodied lessons learned from the Ju-87G. Like the Stuka, the A-10 was built around its gun, a massive 30mm GAU-8/A Avenger rotary cannon specifically designed for tank destruction. The aircraft's design prioritized survivability, accuracy, and the ability to operate from forward airstrips. Pilots trained in tactics remarkably similar to those Rudel pioneered. Low-altitude approaches, exploitation of armor weak points, and attacks from advantageous angles. The parallels are striking. Both aircraft sacrificed speed for stability and firepower. Both relied on heavy cannon-firing, armor-piercing ammunition. Both accepted vulnerability to ground fire as the price of effectiveness. Even the A-10's distinctive profile, high wings, twin engines mounted high on the fuselage, echoes design philosophy prioritizing pilot visibility and damage tolerance, principles the Stuka embodied decades earlier. The Kanonenvogel proved that specialized aircraft could effectively engage armor, establishing doctrines that shaped close air support for generations. The concept of the dedicated tank buster, controversial in 1943, became mainstream by the 1970s and remains relevant today. Rudel's tactical innovations, attacking from specific angles, targeting weak points, coordinating with ground forces, are taught to modern ground attack pilots. But the legacy carries darker notes. The Kanonenvogel couldn't change the war's outcome. Despite hundreds of tanks destroyed and countless successful missions, the Red Army still reached Berlin. Individual skill and tactical innovation proved insufficient against industrial capacity and strategic depth. The Stuka's final evolution demonstrated both the potential and the limitations of air power in combined arms warfare. The Kanonenvogel represents a unique moment in aviation history, when desperation and ingenuity transformed an obsolete dive bomber into a lethal tank destroyer. Hans-Ulrich Rudel and his fellow pilots proved that courage and skill could extend an aircraft's relevance beyond its design parameters, but they also demonstrated that tactical excellence cannot overcome strategic defeat. The Stuka's final chapter ended in May 1945, but its influence echoes through every tank buster that followed. Keep watching Vintage Planes for more untold stories of legendary warbirds that shaped history.